Hello and welcome to lucky episode number 13 of the Strength Coach Roundtable here on RowingChat. My name is Will Ruth, and today, today we're talking about me. I have recently published the second edition of my book, Rowing Stronger, and it is once again available at Rowperfect UK, as well as on my website. And I'm joined by co-presenters Blake Gourley and Joe Deleo. They've both contributed guest chapters to the new edition of the book. So we're going to talk a little bit about what went into the book and what is new in it, as well as their guest chapters. And we're going to talk about some stuff too that didn't make the book. So don't close the window already, because this isn't going to be just straight promotion, hard selling. I hope you know us better than that if you've listened to our shows before. And so we're going to get into this and make this a worthwhile conversation as well. So before we get into that, though, our last episode was way back in September when we took a deep dive into the research on low back pain in rowing. So we'll do a quick bring people up to speed with what you've been doing lately in coaching or in the online rowing world. Blake, how about you get us started?
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for letting me have a guest chapter in your book. It's really exciting, and had a chance to actually read most of it. I didn't just skim it. Read most of it yesterday, and it's an awesome resource. So I'm happy I can be a part of that. So I actually left coaching, and I've been just working on building my training business. And I actually just started teaching at a local university. So fun, exciting changes, but I'm looking forward to it.
I think the last time we talked, you had just gotten back from a certification course, right? Have you added some more acronyms after your name?
Yeah, I don't think I'll add any more though.
What was the course you did?
Pain-Free Performance Specialist by Dr. John Russin.
That's right, because we were talking about it was some of the breathing patterns, right? Was that what we were getting into, or no? It was the how to find somebody's optimal squat technique, right?
Yeah, optimal squat and optimal deadlift, and how not everyone has to do the same thing. Even though we think everyone should be able to lift from the floor, it's not a predestined height because everyone's built differently.
Good. Well, that's some nice foreshadowing for your guest chapter. So we'll definitely come back to that later on. Joe, how about you?
Hey, Will. Yeah, just to reiterate what Blake said, thanks for the opportunity to contribute a guest chapter to the second edition of Rowing Stronger. Appreciate the opportunity. So looking forward to getting some feedback from your readers and what they think about it. So what I've been up to since the September episode, October, I was named the head strength and conditioning coach for the Portuguese Rowing Federation. So working with the team, visiting several times throughout the year for extended camps, and doing the programming for them, and inputting some new skills on land.
Nice, congrats. So did that kind of come out of the camps you've been doing there, or is that a separate relationship? Because I know you've been going over there lately, right?
Yes. So I'll be back in May for another Masters Juniors rowing camp. But the owner of the hotel, Luis Aarons Teixeira, is also the president of the Portuguese Rowing Federation. Mm-hmm. So just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And he got a chance to work with me when I did the camp last May. And we had some discussions, and kind of one thing led to another, and here we go.
Good. Well, may their splits improve, and may your frequent flyer miles balance bloom.
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Well, yeah, I have been a busy boy too. With getting the book ready took a lot of work from the start of the writing process all the way up, and then I've had some other stuff too in coaching. I know I've told both of you guys this off air, but for everybody else, I'm going to be making a cross-country move here pretty soon, leaving Bellingham, Washington behind and heading to central Vermont. My wife has gotten a job there, and it puts me near some rowing, and I also coach lacrosse, and they play that there too. And it just kind of ended up coming together nicely with, I'll be finishing with grad school this quarter. I'm doing my capstone class right now. So it just kind of ended up being the right thing at the right time. And I hope to keep everybody updated on that later on too. It'll be cool to be, just a couple hours away from Boston and, in more of a rowing zone. So if you're in that area and you're listening, definitely drop me a line and, let me know, how bad the adjustment to all the snow is going to be. All right. So let's get into the book then. I'll just give kind of a brief outline in terms of what is new there, and then we'll start talking about guest chapters, and any questions that you guys came up with or anything we want to talk about. So I've been working on it for a little bit over a year now. It was really nice through my master's program at the University of Denver's Masters of Sport Coaching program. I had an independent study course that I had to do, and so I actually made writing the ebook or producing the updates for the book was my independent study class. So not only was that nice to have access to the wealth of development resources available to me at the University of Denver, from the online research libraries to access to my professors and everything, but it also gave me deadlines and someone who I had to be accountable to if I was going to be behind on stuff. So that really helped with getting through the bulk of the updates within winter quarter. Then I was back into spring coaching with lacrosse and rowing, and then summer I took 2 more classes, and so it just kind of got pushed around, and I kept working on it. I kept finding new things that I could sort of improve or expand or clean up and just kind of write more clearly. So when we published the first edition, it was 2015, and it kind of happened by accident, because I wasn't really intending to publish it with a global rowing education company. And then Rowperfect said, "Hey, we read the preview of this. We would like to see about publishing it through our website." And so it was fun to have a chance to go back to it and see, like, all right, I could have written that better. I could have been clearer here. And then in that time too, I coached full time for a year at Western, doing the rowing coaching as well as the strength training. I've coached masters rowers online for strength training programming. I've gotten to work with Marlene Royal through Rowperfect. We co-produced a strength training program, and I've been working with her as a consultant as well. I've done clinics for local high school programs, and so I've really gotten to coach a lot. And in that time, I also did most of my master's program as well. So I really did. I went through the book line by line with updates, adding clarity and detail from the first version. Expanded my chapters on masters rowing, youth rowing, lightweights, and coxswains too. I mean, I believe, as I think you two do as well, that strength training is beneficial for everybody. And I think that if coxswains want to be involved, then I think that it's our responsibility as strength coaches to say, sure, like, let's make this work for you too. Because there's a variety of benefits for strength training beyond just improving your rowing ability. Let's see, I also included sample programs and templates. This was something that I left out of the first version because I was really nervous about people running them as is without any extra thought. And so I'd kind of be interested to hear your thoughts on this too. Because what I didn't want to have happen was somebody run, I say multiple times in the book, like, this is not a just add water program. You need to be able to program around your own specific needs, your racing schedule, your rowing program. Rowing training is so diverse with, the volume and load and how you manage this and how much you work on the ergs and how much you're on the water, that I really don't think it's possible to just have a single stock program. So I was nervous about somebody trying to run it without actually knowing the principles of it. And so I just left that out entirely. But I got a lot of requests for it. And so I included it in the second edition. That was probably one of the chapters that took me the longest to write out was how do I make this clear enough that if somebody did run it as is, it wouldn't be the worst thing that they could do. But ideally, what it does is demonstrates the concepts that are present in the rest of the book, so that somebody can read the book, look at the sample program, go back to the book, and be able to actually build their own program from there. And then I also included revised versions of some of my more popular website series. So Mental Skills for Rowing and mobility for rowers are both in there in sort of a revised and condensed version, which I thought would be useful just, if you wanted to have those kind of for handy reference, and assuming that not everybody who has bought the book has read all 75 plus articles that I've published on my website. And then obviously we have the guest chapters. So, I appreciate you guys thanking me for the opportunity to write, but I really owe you just as much thanks for producing that content. And I know we went back and forth on edits and outlines and getting it together so that it fit in with the rest of the book too. So you guys put a lot of work into that, and they're both areas that I don't have as much experience with myself. So I was really glad to be able to have that opportunity to share your coaching with the worldwide audience. Blake wrote on movement assessments for rowing. There's this list of acronyms. You'll have to tell us what some of the main after his name for all of these different movement certifications. And I think that that's really your powerful background is in seeing how rowers move and trying to improve that through strength training and other training modalities in the weight room. And then Joe wrote on kettlebells. And so we'll talk more about both of these. But I don't know, do you have any thoughts first on the book before we get into your guest chapters or any general kind of questions about it?
Yeah, I totally understand that you were kind of reserved in the first book and you didn't want to share the templates and the programs because you're right, some people may still just kind of jump to it and use it. And I think it's important to note that like you did an excellent job of, if you actually sit down and read it, you're going to have a good idea of how to individualize it and specialize it to your situation. So you could take these programs and just kind of try them out, but understanding it better and being able to tweak it based off of what happens day to day and what your season's like is really the power of what you put together.
Well, thanks, man. I know it's a lofty goal to think that every rower or rowing coach or strength coach, I hope the strength coach would certainly be able to do it, but we'll be able to make those individual adjustments. That was really what I wanted to do, is to provide those tools so that somebody would be able to. We can just get into guest chapter stuff then. Blake, you want to give us just kind of a rundown on what you wrote about with movement assessments for rowing?
Yeah, of course. I think overall, just kind of a quick summary of like the overall message I've been trying to get out in everything that I've written and how I've coached and everything is that there's just this high injury rate in rowing, and it's kind of been normalized. And number one, it's not normal, and it shouldn't be accepted as normal. And two, there's something we can do about it, and we can learn from our past mistakes, our personal mistakes, and we can learn from past coaches' mistakes, and we can make this sport a hell of a lot better. So yeah, like you mentioned, like my perspective is mostly a movement perspective. So what I do is over the last 8 years, I screened 120 athletes about twice a year. And from all that data with the functional movement screen, I was able to basically just figure out like, well, if they have this issue, if they have limitations at the ankle, this is probably going to cause these issues in the stroke. And then it just kind of works through the body that way. And what I tried to do was kind of simplify it so that someone could do the tests on themselves or with their team or with a partner. And then they could at least get a basic idea of what their weakest link is and how it may affect their stroke. And if they start fixing it and working on it, that they might actually see progress in their stroke that they thought couldn't change. And it was something that their coach just kept saying over and over and over again, like stop collapsing into the front end. And it may not actually be something that they can physically change until they work on clearing ankle mobility, for example.
Yeah, that's my favorite, is all those things that, as a rowing coach, we'll bang our heads against a wall about with an athlete without realizing that there might be something structural blocking them from actually being able to do that. It's not that they're sitting there going, oh yeah, I'm going to collapse the catch on this stroke and the next one and the next one, but it's actually that they might not physically be able to do it. So your chapter is kind of providing the tools to be able to say, all right, if this rowing fault continues to happen, and Blake's got a whole table in here for here's what we're seeing and here's what the possible physical structural limitation might be, and then here's how we might be able to fix it too.
Yeah, and on the flip side of it too is what's really interesting is if I've screened an athlete and I did that more this year because I'm working more as a consultant, and I don't know a lot of the athletes, and it's actually a little bit cooler because I'm coaching from a distance without knowing much. So I'm really
Objectify the
just
process
looking,
a little bit. Yeah.
right, exactly. I'm just looking at the data. Um, and the interesting part is I can pretty accurately predict the top 8 athletes based off their movement and their grip strength. Um, and then
So
those,
not looking at rowing technique or 2K score
no,
or
yeah, I don't know.
VO2 max or anything, just based on who moves the best and
Right.
who has the strongest grip.
Yeah. So
That's
I
fascinating.
don't know any of that about these athletes. And the way I look at it is if you don't have any movement limitations, you don't have a parking brake on, so you can drive faster and your car's not going to wear down as quickly, right? So, but the interesting part is those athletes that don't have parking brakes on, no movement limitations, they're also the ones that like easily make changes. They're the ones that you consider as coachable. Um, so yeah, it's not always like it's not just an athlete that's not coachable. It's an athlete that may not have the potential yet.
The physical ability to even respond to feedback.
Right.
Yeah. Well, there was one thing you said too, and I know you mentioned it in the book as well, so I'm glad you brought it up again for the podcast. But they're like, it's weird that injuries are just accepted in rowing because there's no, I mean, aside from like crazy freak accidents or really intense crabs, there's no traumatic force at play in rowing, right? I mean, I coach lacrosse, like it's young men running around beating each other with sticks a lot of times, and a little really hard rubber ball being thrown 100 miles an hour. Like, okay, we can't prevent all the injuries there. Like sometimes stuff is just going to happen, but in rowing, there's so much more that's under our control. And I totally agree with you that to some extent it's a self-imposed problem that we just accept that, oh, like this is just going to happen, and the best people are going to survive.
Yeah, and that's the problem is that mindset, right? So if we continue to think that nothing can change, then nothing's going to change. But if we think that we can improve and do better in terms of the health of our athletes, then we're probably going to see changes. And I think what really sold me on this process was my personal experience. Was my first year coaching. I had 8 injuries out of 32, I think. And then the next year, I implemented a lot of what I've been doing since then. And I had 0 injuries out of the 30ish.
So that's
So
essentially a 100% reduction from year 1 to year 2.
right, so it can have a huge impact, and
Yeah.
some of it was luck. Like it's not just all the changes I
Right.
made, but um, it can make a huge difference.
One of the things that I appreciate from your writing as well as when you talk on the podcast is that you don't talk about preventing injuries. You talk about reducing injury risk. And I think that it's not just semantics. I think it is important that yeah, we're not necessarily setting ourselves a goal or taking credit for preventing injuries, but it's just that we are working across the board to systemically reduce our risk so that when injuries do happen, we can say we did our best and something else happened here, you know?
Right. Yeah. I basically say just be proactive instead of reactive. And we've talked about this on podcasts before is it, if we're just being reactive to an injury, it's really hard to get that athlete back. But if I'm being proactive and I potentially reduce the chance of him actually getting injured in the first place, I'm going to be in a much better position.
Joe, did you have any questions on Blake's chapter with the author himself sitting here in front of you?
Yeah, I did actually. That was great. Thanks for going into the details there, Blake. What is there a particular assessment in relation to movement that you kind of weigh a little bit more, or you felt had a lot more like carryover or kept coming up in terms of the athletes, one that you saw with a lot of frequency?
Yeah, absolutely. So so the functional movement screen for people that aren't familiar is a seven movement test. And I believe I only put 5 in. And those are the ones that I mostly saw issues with over the 8 years. But still the biggest one for me is active straight leg raise. So a lot of people will look at the test and think it's just a hamstring stretch or a hamstring flexibility test. But there's so much more to it. So it could be core, it could be opposite hip flexor. And what I've found is most athletes that don't perform well there, especially if they have an asymmetry, and Will, this relates to your hamstring article that you recently posted. People that have issues there almost always end up having a back injury, and there's data that I'll get, and this actually happened this year, where I sent an email to the coaches and I was like, just so you know, like, I would be very concerned rowing this athlete. Like, I don't know if you should even have them on the rowing machine until you balance out and fix their hips here, because I would be very nervous myself.
Yeah, the active straight leg raise, I mean, that kind of translates directly over to, in a lot of ways, being able to do a, standing toe touch, that forward flexion. You're just doing, you're showing that type of range of motion from a different position. And in a lot of ways, this is actually a lot easier. The demands on the body are a lot easier because you're lying supine on your back on the floor. So you don't have the demands of gravity. So there's not as much stress on the nervous system compared to a standing toe touch, or even, sit and reach test.
Well, in the sit and reach test and the standing toe touch too, you can compensate for a lack of hamstring flexibility with just lumbar flexion, right? Whereas you can't do that if you're lying on your back. You're stuck in neutrality.
Right. And it's also, as Blake kind of mentioned too, that the core control component there, mm-hmm. you're seeing what's happening reciprocally across the body with the opposite side. So it tells you a lot. So that was great. Thanks for sharing, Blake.
Well, so the hamstring article that Blake was referring to, just for the audience benefit, was a research review that I posted on my website called "Is Hamstring Flexibility for Rowers Overrated?" And I will post a link to it in the show notes so you can go and read it too. But it was a research article that it actually studied rowers, which was awesome, because we very rarely get this data on rowers. But the researchers wanted to look at a population of rowers, or a population of athletes that were heavily quad dominant, so the quadriceps, the anterior thigh muscles. They want to look at rowers, and they did a second study group with dancers, and they found that the sit and reach hamstring flexibility analysis did not predict low back pain. They did find, or the one separate study found, that asymmetry, and this is what Blake was talking about, that asymmetry in the sit and reach, asymmetry in the straight leg raise, which is the test that Blake demonstrates in the book, did have a predictive effect, but that what did predict back pain was the ratio of quadricep strength to hamstring strength. And they took a second study group from that and found that they improved the hamstring strength of a group of female rowers, and found that those athletes who had all had low back pain before missed fewer practices during the hamstring strengthening protocol due to low back pain. So they decreased their injury just by increasing their hamstring strength. And so that was an interesting article in terms of looking at, okay, well, it's not just flexibility and it's not just strength, but it's what can we specifically look at improving with rowers. And I don't think that it takes away the importance of doing something like a flexibility test. And so, Blake, I'd like to hear your kind of thoughts on that too, for why that's still worthwhile, basically.
Yeah, and I think where people kind of get confused is people are like, oh, well, if my hamstrings are tight, let's just say it's hamstrings are tight, then I'm just going to stretch him. That's the solution. Like, he can't get good body forward, so his hamstrings must be tight. Let's just stretch him. And that's only part of the solution, if that's actually part of the problem. So, like we're talking about,
the theory is that if the hamstrings aren't strong enough, then the quadriceps will exert such a tension, and because we use the quadriceps all the time in rowing, and we underuse the hamstrings in rowing. So unless you're doing extra strengthening for the hamstrings, you're probably not keeping that ratio. So if the quadriceps are over strong, then it pulls the pelvis into anterior tilt, which will then stretch the hamstrings, so that no matter how much flexibility you get, you're still not going to be able to overcome that anterior pelvic tilt. So until you restore that balance and put the pelvis back to neutral, you won't be able to see what the actual hamstring length is anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it's all a part of the equation. So like people want to stretch and think that's going to fix it. It's you got to do soft tissue work, you got to stretch, and then you got to use that new mobility, and then you got to strengthen that mobility and strengthen those specific muscles so that it actually stays around, and you can use it, because you're just going to stretch and you're going to go step off the curb and it's going to go back to what it was before.
Right. How quickly does that effect just dissipate? Yeah. So I had one question that, like, you provide the details for what test to use and how a rowing coach or a rowing strength coach should use them in the immediate practice, but how would you actually use it in a broader context? Like, is it something you do once with an athlete before they start training, or is it something you come back to every quarter, every so often as a test retest, or kind of how does this fit into the big picture of a strength training program?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the most ideal situation, you test that person's biggest limiting factor before each training session, but that's not realistic for most people, just because movement can change that quickly. But in terms of what I've been doing with large groups of about 120 athletes, is we just test twice a year. So it'll give us a starting point, and then it'll give us feedback at the end of the season of whether or not we were doing a decent job or not. You could definitely do it more. The more often, the better. It's just not totally practical for a big team.
Yeah. And I mean, still, I mean, even just doing it at the start of the season, the end of the season, you're still getting 8 data points for an athlete over their career, and then you multiply that by 120, and you got a pretty good data set if you're actually just doing it even that often.
Yeah, and I'm interested because, Joe, I know you use the FMS as well, so I'm interested in how often and how you use it as well.
Yeah, I typically do at least twice a year. I went to foundational strength in November, which was FMS 2 combined with kettlebells, taught by Brett Jones, who works for Strong First. He's on the advisory board and the director of education. Sorry, the director of education for Strong First and on the FMS advisory board. And so he actually said he recommended, probably every 8 to 12 weeks with a little bit more frequency rescreening, just so you kind of stay in touch and make sure that they're not slipping back into, some of those limitations in any of the patterns that you identified from the original baseline. So that's kind of one thing I've been trying to do a little bit better job of is revisiting that on a little bit more frequent basis. Especially if you're not seeing athletes with as much regularity, to keep them honest, keep them on track.
Just that timeline, I mean, just the phrase 8 to 12 weeks makes me think strength training training cycle. Could we incorporate that into our deload week, essentially, from strength training if we're taking one about every 8 to 12 weeks?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, absolutely. And I think it's good. It's just good to do that because, things come up, things happen all the time. You're dealing with athletes, who are receiving stress from their training load, but, some of them might be high school or college athletes. They have a high academic workload. So you never know what's what or how they are being affected. So it's good to kind of make sure you're checking in. And if you need to take things off the table in terms of skills or specific exercises because they're not cleared to currently do them per the FMS, it's good to know that.
Yeah. So that's actually probably a nice segue. Blake, did you have something to add there?
I was just going to say, in a small group setting that I'm currently in, where I'm working with anywhere from 1 to 3 people at a time, if I'm working through any kind of movement issues, I'll check that person's individual issue at the beginning of each session, and then that's what we'll address that day. But I know not everyone has a situation like that. So
sure, yeah, that's kind of the highly individualized context. Yeah. All right, so Joe, we'll go ahead and let you take it away with kettlebells. I mentioned in the intro to your chapter, and I give you credit fully for turning me on to the kettlebell and rowing training. I found the kettlebell swings particularly useful, so we'll talk about that some more. And I was glad to see that your chapter focused heavily on those. So you want to just kind of give us also just a brief rundown on yours?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I appreciate that, man. I'm glad that the kettlebell and the kettlebell swing has made its way into your programming. So basically in my chapter, I kind of provide a brief background on the utility and value of integrating kettlebell training for rowing athletes, and how I believe it'll help, both in terms of improvements in work capacity and power development, but also in terms of movement skill, how the sequencing of what you're trying to do really carries over to the dynamic action in the rowing stroke. So, in the rowing stroke, we have two phases: the recovery phase and the dry phase. So, and with kettlebells, we talk a lot about, especially at Strong First, tension and relaxation. So the dry phase, you're under a lot of tension, you're working. The recovery phase, relaxation. Well, you have that exact duality, that yin and yang, during the kettlebell swing. So there's a huge emphasis on trying to improve and increase both ends of the spectrum, right? So making sure that you're tensing, pushing the feet through the floor, squeezing the glutes, bracing the abdominals, and you have tension from the shoulders down. You're not carrying excessive tension in the face and the neck, areas that you wouldn't want it, that would actually slow you down. So a lot of the same things that you're trying to do in the rowing stroke, we want our athletes to do. You get that in the swing, on top of improving power, improving work capacity.
So that was, yeah, I mean, the kettlebell swing falls into that interesting intersection of being very close to a rowing specific motor pattern, and also great for strength and explosiveness at a general muscular or athletic level. And that was one of the things that turned me on to the swing the most, was seeing athletes really get the push swing or the hanging motion in the stroke after practicing it with a kettlebell swing. You go, here's the athlete who really struggles with this in the boat, and then we can have them use it, similar skill set, in a different way with kettlebell swing, and then they could transfer that back to the rowing stroke. I think, it's easy to abuse that and turn everything in the weight room has to be something rowing specific, right? But there's a few lifts like the kettlebell swing, and I think the trap bar deadlift too, that I think serve this nice balance of being naturally rowing specific and also really great at a general muscular athletic level.
Absolutely, 100%. And I'm really glad you mentioned the deadlift, because in terms of the progression, that's kind of the starting point. Is you have the movement pattern, the hip hinge. So you're learning how to make sure that they know how to posterior weight shift, move their hips backwards behind the ankles, and have, if you looked at them from side view, they have that nice sideways V, shoulders above the hips above the knees, and the athlete, depending on their skill, their ability level, their training, age with strength and conditioning, they may pick up the hip hinge and the deadlift very quickly. Other athletes may need several weeks, cementing the hip hinge. So the deadlift is really, really a critical step that you can't rush, and you can't, go past too quickly, because you're laying the foundation for the kettlebell swing by doing the deadlift. And the variation that we're talking about is a sumo kettlebell deadlift. So for individuals that may have had some back issues, this is a great entry point to the deadlift, because you're placing the kettlebell directly between the feet, lined up with the malleolus, the ankle bone. So it's directly under the individual center of mass, right? So it's much more spine sparing. It's not out in front of the body like a straight bar deadlift. And the trap bar deadlift is great. It's definitely much easier on the back as well.
But it is definitely more challenging. You can load it a lot more than the sumo. So I mean that's helpful for in some ways, but also can hold you back in other ways.
Yes, and that's where I start all my athletes off of, not just rowing, but the athletes that I work with in the sports performance clinic. we start with a sumo kettlebell deadlift, because I can get in there. And if I need to have them kind of adjust their quote unquote, their levers, their hips, their femurs, their torso angle, those things, we can do that. So again, so you set that, they spend some time patterning and cementing the hip hinge with the deadlift, sumo kettlebell deadlift. And then from there, we use that as a ramp of progression into moving from a grind to a ballistic, an explosive full body movement with the kettlebell swing. And that will tie very nicely into the rowing stroke.
And the hip hinge is so crucial, because if they can't do it with their feet on solid ground, either unloaded or loaded with a kettlebell or sumo kettlebell, they're not doing it at 30 plus strokes a minute in the boat. And that hip hinge motion is so critical to getting out of bow cleanly. That's the motion of getting the hands away, the body rock over from the pelvis, not from the upper back, which then just turns into that rounded position. And so it's funny to hear, I mean, our coaching cues are coming back here to our last episode with low back pain, because if the athlete's not getting that reach correctly and they're not setting their body up on the recovery, they're not going to be in a good position to transfer force at the catch, and they're going to end up in a higher risk bracket for low back pain and rib stress injuries. Yeah, absolutely.
You're talking about, just like you said, being able to shift the weight from the back of the seat to the front of the seat, and you're not going to move through the same range of motion that you do in a hip hinge for the deadlift or the kettlebell swing that you do on the seat of the ergometer or in the rowing shell. But the movement skill is still there. It's still there. And for the athlete to be able to learn that in an environment, in a gym setting where they don't have a ton of other feedback being placed on them, wake, coaching launch, noise, other rowers that are throwing off the balance of the boat, it's a great opportunity for them to learn that skill and fine tune it. And then you go back to the ergometer or back into the boat, and you have some very nice transference like you're talking about.
And right, with that transference, it doesn't have to happen all the time. Not every single lift needs to be that transference, but it's awesome when you find those ones that are just sort of perfectly naturally like, oh man, this is it. Like we can use this and help someone become a better rower, and also build more posterior chain strength, build general athletic qualities of the hip hinge and the push swing, or whatever you want to call the recovery in the drive phase. So it's great. You can sort of find those double whammy lifts.
Yeah. And the other thing is, back to your article regarding hamstrings, is you're getting, like you just said, a lot of that posterior chain development, and that you get a ton of hamstring strengthening with the kettlebell swing.
Yeah, getting off the quads and into the posterior. Yeah.
You got it.
Joe, I was going to ask you, you touched on it in the book, and I think it's really important, and it's not something I completely understand myself. So I think it might be important to touch on, but the way you breathe when you do a swing or a deadlift, coming from Strong First, and how they teach that. Yeah,
absolutely. So very simply, we got two types of breathing. So you have your anatomical. So what we're doing, right now, is we're having conversation, right? And then we have biomechanical. So what we want to do when we're doing the biomechanical breathing match during a deadlift or during a kettlebell swing is, so let's use the kettlebell swing as an example. So the bell's on the floor, I hip hinge, tilt the handle towards me. I hike past the bell between my legs. So before I do that, I'm going to take a sniff of air into my nose right before I hike past the bell off of the floor. So I'm taking a small sniff of air, storing that bubble of intra-abdominal pressure into my diaphragm. And then as I go through quadruple extension, ankle, knee, hip, torso, all right, when I get to the hip extension part, that's when I let out that hiss sound, right, to really lock in and generate a lot more tension around the abdominals, around the glutes, around the quads, and hold my body in a nice strong position as my arms fulcrum away from the body, and then you have the bell kind of perpendicular, right? So it's the furthest point away from the body, but my torso is basically in a standing plank position, right? So I'm nice and rock solid, and I'm tight, and I'm under a lot of tension. And then as the bell comes and returns back down towards the body, the elbow bicep connects to the rib cage. We're then going to hip hinge again and take another sniff of air back into the diaphragm as we go into the bottom position, back into that hike pass position in the bottom.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if did I address your question, Blake?
No, yeah, that's clear. I think the way a lot of people lift is basically they'll almost hold their breath and then they'll exhale throughout the whole movement. So it's a different take on that for sure.
Yeah. And so I think, just to make sure this is clear to everybody, so the key is doing it on hip extension. So there's a difference if you're letting out that sound, that breathing at hip extension versus at the top of the swing when the bell is now at perpendicular. You've already completed the work phase, right? So you want to be exhaling that power breath on hip extension, the hip snap, right? And that would be no different if we were doing the kettlebell clean or the kettlebell snatch, right? So I want to exhale powerfully to get a little bit more power out of my body, right? And utilize that as much as possible.
I think it's different too. With you drew the distinction between the grind versus the ballistic, and I think on the ballistic lift, then it's got to be that short explosive breath, kind of like your lift. Whereas Blake, maybe the more of the Valsalva kind of maneuver breathing that you're talking about, maybe more appropriate for the grind.
Yeah, and then I guess that opens up the discussion for how we breathe in the boat. We don't need to talk about that now,
and that one may have to wait for another time, right? but I do think it's another good example of being able to transfer those skills over. At the very least, you're teaching the athletes the skill of breathing in an intentional way, and then the rowing coach can take those skills and make them into what they want to do on the boat, right?
Yeah, and I think that's what it's all about, right? So it's all about trying to improve skill and have some transference into what they're doing in the boat and make them better athletes, a little bit more injury resilient, and improve performance, right? And so it's giving you kind of different ways to look at and think about the rowing stroke instead of kind of being so stuck in some traditional mindsets where we're getting out of that and being a little bit more innovative and creative in our thinking and how we look at these things.
I think that's as good a place as any to end this episode. So thank you guys both so much for your work on the chapters, and to the audience, I hope you really enjoy getting a brief chapter-long taste of Blake and Joe's coaching. I really enjoyed, one of the big differences between the first edition and the second edition was how much I got to work with other people through the writing of the second edition. And I mean, there's obviously, like, your guest chapters kind of came out of our 3 years now of podcasting and talking together off the air too about rowing and strength training and how we could be doing things better. But also all of the 10 or so people who reviewed the book, I know individually. And so it wasn't just enjoyable because they wrote some really nice things about the book. But the blurb that they wrote in the book also came after they got to give me all of the critical feedback that I could handle. And every single person who wrote a blurb also had some really good comments on how to make the book better and specific places where I could improve it. So it was just a ton of fun to get to really work with everybody and kind of just pull things together over the last 3 years. So thank you both for being here for this episode. And for the audience, I have a thank you for you too. The book is available at Rowperfect UK. You can go and look at Rowing Stronger in their e-shop. It's available in ebook form. And it's also available at my website at RowingStronger.com. And if you want to go straight to the link, it's RowingStronger.com/book. And I can offer a discount on my website. So if you go there and you put in the code Roundtable, all one word, ROUNDTABLE, just like our Strength Coach Roundtable, until March 7th, that will give you $9 off. So that'll bring the price down to $21. So thank you so much. Whether you are just listening to the episode or whether you're going to buy the book too, thank you. And if you have any questions, please either leave them in the comment section or post on social media. We'll put the recap up as usual, now found on rowing.chat, which is the new site of RowingChat. And yep, that's about it. Until next time, thanks again.